So here I went through 11 steps of gluconeogenesis to get back to one glucose molecule. There were only 10 steps, of course, for glycolysis. The reason it takes an extra one is because it requires 2 to get back to pyruvate at the beginning. Now, if you don't want free glucose for export from the cell, and instead you want the glucose to be stored as glycogen, then we're going to be more efficient and skip the glucose 6-phosphatase reaction and proceed with a mutase. So if this glucose molecule is destined to become glycogen, then it needs to be activated at carbon 1 instead of carbon 6.